Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Msgr. Jim Lisante. Today, my guest is David Bonagura. He's the author of two books. One is called Steadfast in Faith, and the newer book is called Staying with the Catholic Church. At a time when many people consider leaving the church, David's encouraging us to look again. Stay with us for our conversation with teacher, professor, and writer, David Bonagura. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Msgr. Jim Lisante, and David Bonagura joins me now. David teaches Latin and theology at Regis High School in New York City, and he's also an adjunct professor of classical languages at St. Joseph's Seminary in Yonkers, New York, and an adjunct professor of theology at Catholic Distance University. His latest book is called Staying with the Catholic Church. The subtitle is Trusting God's Plan of Salvation. David has written numerous popular articles for various publications in print and online, including America, Catholic World Report, The Catholic Thing, and the Wall Street Journal. David lives on Long Island with his wife Amanda and their 6 children. He's here with us today to talk about his life, his family, his Catholic education, and his latest book, Staying with the Catholic Church, and the faith and the values that sustain David. Joining me now, I'm so pleased to welcome to Personally Speaking, author and professor, David Bonagura. David, it's good to see you again. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, Monsignor. Thanks for having me.
David, we're going to talk about the books and about your teaching of theology and how wonderful you write. But I have to start with a throwback question. The last time I sat down with you face to face, I think may have been an International Delight Cafe or George Martin or some other Rockville Center establishment. And you were thinking very seriously about the priesthood. Now I look and I see he's married to Amanda and he has 6 children, 5 boys and 1 girl, who range in age from 16 to 1, Joe, Charlie, Stephen, Anthony, Maggie, and John. What happened?
God has his way of doing things. What can I say?
No, it's a wonderful thing, but that's terrific. And tell me a little bit about Amanda. You know, when I do weddings myself every weekend, David, I ask every person I do their wedding for to write me an essay. Why of the billion people in the world they might have chosen, why is this the one? You probably didn't have that as a homework assignment for your wedding, but why is Amanda the one for you?
Amanda and I met at Holy Cross College. We were teammates on the track team, and we became friends. We both became more interested in our faith together, and we were involved with the student group that was doing that sort of thing. And through that interest, God kind of took care of the rest, as they say.
Okay. What has she got that enriches your life?
Everything. She's very hardworking. She's so devoted to our children. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And her faith just blows me away, how she's so devoted, particularly to prayer. And she believes so deeply that every one of her prayers are going to be answered in how she approaches things. She organized prayer groups and lists for our parish, Our Lady of Victory in Floral Park. So she's constantly a model of faith for me.
Isn't that great to marry someone like that? Now, when you have as many children as you do, I'm wondering, and I always get this question on a program like this from parents and grandparents around the country who watch it. Father, what's the best way to pass the faith on? You and Amanda have this faith that you love, that you treasure. Have you guys figured out what the very best way to share that faith with your children might be?
Well, I guess the proof would be in the pudding if they survive teenage years. So we don't have the proof yet, but we certainly try our best. And it's simply by living authentically ourselves, but also we do lots of direct instruction where there's opportunities and where we'll, certain times that we're going to pray this, we're going to go do this, we're going to go to this event, we're going to all the traditional liturgies and so on. But also when things come up that are not right, things that we see in the newspaper, things that are immoral, things that are lacking in faith, we make sure we point that out to the kids and say, oh, this is not how things are supposed to be done.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you too, because we are all the product of the so-called family of origin. I had the privilege of years ago living at St. Agnes Cathedral and getting to know Diane and Dave, your parents. When you look back at the way they raised you, What do you think Diane and Dave did right?
Everything. My parents are great parents. They took 4 kids and they put us all through Catholic school from kindergarten all the way through university level. And everything that we needed, they provided for us. And I'm just thinking today about them, because tomorrow morning, before I go to do one of my side jobs, I have to drive in the city. I have to drive my son out to St. Anthony's High School. He's the manager of the JV football team. So I was thinking how my parents used to drive us all over creation, just for this game, for that game, for this activity. And I think that model really taught me, I caught it rather than was formally taught it. Thinking back on it, I realized what they were doing, but what it means to be a parent, just to give and not to count the cost.
Yeah. David Bonagura is our guest. David, I had the privilege of reading Steadfast in Faith. I haven't yet read the new book, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But, one of the things I loved about Steadfast in Faith, I remember the theology books that we had in seminary, in particular, our theological anthropology professor was a great guy, a wonderful human being, but he wrote a book called Man, Believer, and Unbeliever that was almost unreadable because the sentences were an essay long, and I'm sure it made sense to him, but for us, it was a challenge. The way you write is wonderful in that you take concepts of our theology and belief, and you talk in a way that's clearly understandable for any reader, I think. Was that on purpose? And where does the gift come from to take difficult, challenging concepts and to make them readable and understandable for the average guy?
Certainly the intention. Both books, Steadfast in Faith and Staying with the Church, are written for the regular Catholic in the pew. And I don't know where the gift comes from, but I'd certainly say that I'm a teacher first and foremost. That's what I love to do, and that's what I do. And that's the key to teaching, is how can you make something, whatever it is, interesting to whoever the audience is, whether it be teenagers in high school, whether it be adults in the seminary program, in the MA program that I teach in as an adjunct, whatever that is, find your audience and then find a way to meet him, her, them where they are, give them something that they would be interested in and develop it from there. That's the approach that I take.
We have in our parish, Our Lady of Lourdes in Massapequa Park, New York, we have, I think on Long Island, the biggest pre-Cana. And I've recently been doing it on Zoom, but usually in person. But there's a section of the day where we talk about they are nominally Catholic. They're in their 20s, some early 30s, and the vast majority of them are getting married in church more for culture or family purposes. But very little are strong in their belief, and very, very few are willing to give that even 1 hour a week of the 168 hours a week to go to church, go to Mass. When I ask them why they're not going, as a man who is a true apologist for the church, let me ask you, their objections are very often centered on 2 things. One is that the church is so heavily dominated, they say, by foreign priests that they go to Mass and get nothing out of it because of the accent. I love these foreign priests and thank God for them. We'd have to close half our churches. But the other thing they complain about, of course, is the scandals. I was okay with the church until, I don't believe that, by the way. I think none of these people stopped going to church because of the scandal. I think the scandal just gave them a proximate excuse. But if you were dealing with them, and I'm not sure if you and Amanda are active in pre-Cana, but how would you respond to those 2 interesting things that always come up? I get nothing out of going to church, especially in light of the domination of foreign-born priests. And secondarily, the scandal made me lose confidence in my church.
I think both of those motives there are human-driven. The idea, the foreign priests don't appeal to me, the way the certain priests behave don't appeal to me. Going to church, first and foremost, isn't about people, it's about God and worship of God who made us, created us. Yeah, that guy. He made us, created us to be in a relationship with him, and he's our destiny. So we go there because we ought and we owe him everything from our lives all the way on through to the hairs on our head, which he counts. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing is Mass is about you, but how it's about changing you. And how does it change you? Not because you necessarily can understand the homily or because you like the priest. Mass changes you because it's God's chance to work in you. As that sacrifice on the cross is represented at the Mass, each and every single Mass, that moment of salvation, that's how God wants to come to us. He offers us to participate in that saving act, not because we deserve it, certainly not, but because he wants us, he invites us. And there's always those parables in the gospel where about the wedding feast. People are invited, but they don't want to come. Or they are invited and they come, but they don't wear the correct wedding garment. So they're not supposed, so they miss out. So people missed out on Jesus' time, they're missing now out too. So the question really needs to be flipped. Right? It's not what am I getting out of Mass, is what can I put into this? Because there's a God there who wants to speak to me. And I think I should be humble enough to let him talk.
David Bonagura is our guest, and interestingly enough, his second book is called "Staying with the Catholic Church." So these people who have walked away from the church because of the scandal are obviously shaken by it, they say. David, I don't know anyone who loves the church who wouldn't have to admit that they were heartbroken that perhaps 4% of priests chose to act wrongly, or that the church was not as forthcoming as it should have been about those things. For yourself, as a believing, practicing Catholic, how did you and Amanda parry the church and the handling of the scandals?
Well, it was certainly depressing. It was and distressing. Both were not, back in 2002, the revelations of it and when it was really hot. And then again in 2018, the scandal in 2018 regarding ex-Cardinal McCarrick was particularly odious. And that was really the motivation for writing this second book, Staying with the Catholic Church. Yeah. It comes down to that line that Peter says to Jesus, when everyone's leaving Jesus in John, as recorded in John chapter 6, when Jesus says something outrageously scandalous, he says, "You will not have life unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood." And of course, we know what that means, but his hearers in real time had to have been totally blown away. What on earth is this guy talking about? Eat his flesh and drink his blood. And that's before the Last Supper. That's before Good Friday, before the resurrection. And people leave. Yeah. And then Jesus goes to the apostles and says, "Are you going to leave me too?" And then Peter says, "Lord, to whom shall we go? Right. You have the words of eternal life." And that's what the church has. So God has rigged it, right? This is God's church. It's not Pope Francis's church or Pope Benedict's church or Msgr Lisante's church or my church. It's God's church. He's rigged it. He's not going to let it fail. He rigged it in such a way, in a strange way. If I were setting it up, maybe I wouldn't have done the same. But he chose a lot of fallible instruments through which he will channel his infallible grace. Yeah. But the grace is not going to be thwarted by you or by me or by any other believer because of what we do. It's always God working through us, and God's grace will have the final word. Thanks be to God, it will have the final word.
David Bonagura is our guest. Steadfast in Faith is the book I mentioned I read. What was your hope? Well, let me give you the audience I'm talking about. Many times on a program like this, you're a believing, practicing Catholic, and that's wonderful. But I don't want this show to be just for those. So I've invited many times people who call themselves agnostic and atheist to have them on the program. Would your book, the new book, or the Steadfast in Faith, be something that the guy who thinks he's an agnostic or an atheist might pick up and find a way home?
I certainly hope so. Yeah. The book is written in two parts, Steadfast in Faith. The part one looks at the secularism of our world, and it drills into lots of different theories of living, different worldviews, particularly one that is popular today, the scientific naturalist worldview, meaning that the only thing that's good and true in the world is that which is governed by science. Okay, well, I look at some of the fallacies in that statement, particularly how it's a belief that's totally predicated on faith, because it's not scientific to say science is the correct way to go. That's a statement of faith. That doesn't involve measuring or calculating in any way.
It's an act of faith.
It's a faith-based statement. So if we can pull that back and realize that so many of even if the atheists make so many faith-based assumptions, not faith in God necessarily, but faith in, I trust that this is true, even though it's not verifiable by observation, then we can get somewhere. And I have a chapter on the existence of God where I take seriously the objections to God's existence by the famous atheist Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist. And he has a book, which I don't recommend reading, called The God Delusion,
Right.
And I go through some points that he makes on and refute those in a way that people can understand.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first part of the book. The second part then explains in some detail what is faith. So when we get to church on Sunday, we stand and say, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty. The rest of the book is, what does it mean when we say, I believe?
Yeah.
It's number one, it's a statement about what I think, that the world is more than just the visible that's in front of me. And then how do I believe in the church? Well, teach us a little bit about baptism.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a chapter on the faith and the church and how we can't have faith really without the church. The church is our means through which we encounter Christ. And then there's some more practical chapters that discuss the relationship between faith and emotions, faith and politics, faith and suffering. So it's the whole aspect of the life of faith. It looks at in little snapshots, but always with the eye of the world that we're living in and how faith is seen by most people and how it's challenged by so many people in today's world.
Let me ask you this: when you, if you deal at all in the world of pre-K, they often say, the young people, I was raised in the church, but I'm not sure that I have a lot of faith. And I'll say back to them, you're about to make a lifetime commitment to someone because you believe they love you and you love them, but you can't, as you said, verify it. You can't prove that 20 years from now, they'll still love you the way you want to be loved. So how can you make this leap of faith? And they don't see that we have within us this capacity to believe even beyond what we expect. And when you married Amanda, it was a great act of faith, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And happily, it had a happy evolution.
Happy evolution, right? And it's, who could think it would be 17 years this July, and wonderfully can't predict any of this stuff, right? The world happens, life happens.
Yeah.
God allows His will to unfold, and we're along for the ride. And so the journey of faith is really the journey of marriage. But to believe in God, and God just pulls you along. All the great spiritual, Amanda and I talk about this all the time. Especially lately, all the great spiritual masters, what do they all say? What do they all have in common? That God's will is whatever is right in front of you at that moment.
Yeah.
So the sudden diaper explosion after you've put the baby in the infant carrier and you're about to go off to wherever it is you have to go and have to take him out. All those things. God's will is right in front of you.
Right in front of us every single day.
He's always given us these opportunities. And He's talking to us, maybe not the direct way that you and I are speaking, but he speaks to us through these things. And it's our task to learn to listen.
Yeah. David Bonagura is our guest. David, most people will never have the experience that you have a privilege to be a part of. You teach at a seminary, St. Joseph's Seminary in Yonkers, New York. What kind of young men are stepping forward to serve the church now? From your overview, is it promising for the church, the people you meet along the way who have embraced a priestly vocation?
Yes, I think it's very promising. There's some very fine young men I've had the pleasure to meet and have the pleasure to teach. They're absolutely dedicated to the Lord. They know what they're doing is countercultural. It doesn't bother them.
Wow.
They're willing to make the sacrifice. The program of formation it's a long stretch. They do a minor seminary a couple of years. They do a degree in philosophy, and then they do 4 or 5 years in the major seminary. They do a degree in theology. They also take a year off and do a pastoral year where they serve in a parish. So it's a long road that these guys travel, and they need to want it in order to get there. And most of them seem like they have their eye on the prize. Yeah. They know why they're there, and sometimes we seminary professors give them a lot of hoops to jump through, but nevertheless they do it, and they do it well.
Yeah, I was thinking, later on they'll have so many experiences of death. Part of any priest's job is to give consolation and hope about the life to come. But didn't you have recently in your seminary the loss even of your academic dean?
Yeah, the great Father Kevin O'Reilly, who's my teacher. What a great guy.
I heard that.
So humble and so hardworking. And he taught every class in the building. A lot of times most academic deans would farm all the courses that he taught out to adjuncts, like people like me, but no, he did everything. And he was so supportive of the men and their formation. It was just so terrible to lose him at such a young age. He was 51.
Heartbreaking, yeah, but glad that they knew someone of that quality and caliber. Now, David Bonagura has another experience in vocation, and that's as a teacher at Regis High School, which is a very impressive Jesuit-run school in New York City. We had on the program Kyle MacArthur, an actor who was on Broadway in something called Superhero. And I asked him about his faith development in Regis, and he said what he loved about the teaching of the faith there was that no one was force-feeding the faith, but teaching them how to think in such a way that they would come to embrace the faith on their own. Is that your experience too?
To a degree, I taught Kyle Latin. I tend to be a little bit more direct maybe than some of my colleagues, but because I think it's important to teach fundamentals and let students, especially when it comes to the faith. Okay. Last year, I taught freshman theology, and we had rejigged the curriculum, the course. So we called the course Introduction to Catholicism, Introduction to Catholic Faith and Practice. Mm-hmm. And we went through, and here are the things of this is what the creed and the sacraments. This is what we believe. This is why we believe it. When it comes down to faith, ultimately, we can't force anyone to believe anything. Right? Pope John Paul used to say that faith, God imposes nothing, he proposes. So we can propose these things.
David, how would you suggest, and this is just a suggestion on your part, but I will then, when I'm talking, not just talk about the scripture and its application to our daily lives, but also then say, now let's move from the scripture to some current events. And very, very often, I will have to address the fact that there's no way to get around the reality that leading Catholic political figures, obviously including the president and our own governor, are living and teaching and guiding the country in ways that are incredibly compromising of everything we hold to be sacred. Now, when I do that, happily, I'm in a parish where 3/4 of the people say I'm open to what you're saying, and I agree. But I'll always get an email or a letter the following week saying, "How dare you pick on a public figure from the pulpit?" Should I be going near that, do you think? And what should we rightly be saying to those who are leading the public astray?
Well, the people who are in public, and that's the part of their job, is they're held accountable in front of others for what they do, for good and for ill. If they want to be praised for whatever it is, policies or programs that they're able to develop, well, then they also need to be able to take that criticism. And anyone who's going to call himself or herself a Catholic and stand in the public needs to at least do so in the right way. And that doesn't mean that the person is going to be without sin. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who publicly make a living by distancing themselves and openly rejecting not just nice church policies like, oh yeah, you should give $30 to the collection every time you show up at church, especially if you go to Our Lady of Lourdes in Massapequa. Not just that, there's a little plug there for your collection, but things that are essential. And the protection of human life, which is a gift from God, is number one. That's essential. And it's maybe not something that needs to be harped on every single week, but nevertheless, it needs something that needs to be presented. And it can be presented when it's in the news, because it's in the news not infrequently. But these are things, but at the end of the day, and I talk about this in both books, that the idea that the church proposes Christ's teaching. She doesn't invent stuff on her own. She doesn't do it to make our life miserable. The reason is to get us to eternal life. She's just an instrument to pass on God's teaching. And here's the thing. All those teachings are related. It's the same church that teaches that life is sacred, that teaches that there's three persons in one God. And if we're going to say, oh, well, I'll take the three persons in one God thing, but I'm not going to take the life is sacred thing, well, then you're at the minimum, you're not going to have a very sound relationship with your church, because you're say, oh, well, its authority is only so-so. That's not going to work. There's an organic principle of the church, and that the church only comes as the extension of the incarnation in time. She perpetuates Christ to us. So in doing so, those teachings are those of Christ. To cast them aside and say, they're not for me, is really a serious, serious thing.
For our viewers and listeners around the world and around the country, if you're interested in more of David Bonagura and his way of thinking and his entrance into a better understanding of the church that we love, David, this is your opportunity. Can you tell our folks how are they supposed to get a copy of Steadfast in Faith, Catholicism and the Challenges of Secularism, and Staying with the Catholic Church? Where do they go to find these books?
Both books are available from Amazon.com.
Okay.
They're also available from their respective publishers. Cluna Media published Steadfast in Faith. Cluna Media does a fantastic job of putting a lot of old books, old Catholic books, back into print. And then Staying with the Catholic Church comes from Scepter Publishers, and they have their main focus is on devotional publishing, and they have wonderful books that could help one grow in the spiritual life. So you can get them from the publishers or from Amazon.
Is there a David Bonagura website that people should be aware of?
There is. davidgbonagurajr.com has links to those books. It also has links to essays, the more recent essays that I've written. I post them on there.
I'd like to thank David Bonagura for being with us, for writing his books, for talking so openly and honestly about the richness of the church and the depth of his faith and what he longs to share with his students, with his family, with every person he has the joy to meet. David, keep on keeping on. We need your voice, and I appreciate the wonderful opportunity we've had today to talk about your books, which I hope our listeners will get, and not only get, but read. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Monsignor. Great talking to you.
As we end today's program, I want to thank all of you for being with us. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can reach me at personallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. You can also go to past episodes by going to YouTube and punching in Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante. And don't forget to click, like, and subscribe. Also, Personally Speaking is available as a podcast on personallyspeakingpodcast.buzzsprout.com or www.closeencountertv.com or www.ollmp.org. I'd like to thank all of you who are out there supporting our program. Personally Speaking is also on Facebook at Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante. Please share and let others know about Personally Speaking. Personally Speaking is made possible by the generosity of many. I hope you'll be one of the people supporting our program. I'm privileged to serve as host and executive producer of Personally Speaking. Our producer is Lisa Jandovitz. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be with you again next time on Personally Speaking.